This is my story, how we went from minus $10,000 in my bank account to building over $1 million a year content business in just only 5 years. But to tell you exactly how I did it and the exact framework that we've used, I want to go back to the very beginning. I grew up in a very small town in Ireland in a county called Cork. I was super remote, really far away from any sort of big city or big community or big network. I was super rural area that all I'd seen is just green fields and cows for the majority of my early years. During this period, I was actually extremely sick. I had chronic asthma at the time and missed a lot of school. This was between 50 days a year to maybe 60 days a year, and I quickly started falling behind. At the age of 4 and 5, teacher came to me at that particular point in time and said I was too dyslexic at the time to read or write. This was a common pattern that repeated throughout school, throughout a lot of my education, and it held me back in a lot of ways. I was immediately segregated from the majority of kids. I was put into a special learning class at the time, and I was really beginning to even fall further behind. I'd lost a lot of the confidence that I was good at school, or I could be good at school, or I could do anything meaningful to do with education. So at that time, I'd become more disconnected with education than ever before. At that point, I was getting into sport, and as a kid, that's just not much to do. This is when I'd really kind of fallen in love with different aspects of sport. Things that really had clicked when I was quite young was athletics, specifically 100-meter sprinting and rugby. These were two things that I did not have to go to school to learn for, especially when I'd spent a lot of time outside of school. And I'd really fallen in love with that process, whereas during a regular education system, I didn't actually have a lot of things to cling to. I was failing in school, I was falling behind, I was doing extra grinds, I was put in different classes, and nothing was really sticking. Whereas when it came to sport, it came quite naturally to me. I could get up, I could run, I could train, I could play with other people. This is when I devoted a lot of my time into playing much more of an infinite game, trying to improve my time for running, even when I was very, very young. And I'd fallen into this process of just continuous improvement that had actually stemmed into everything that I've done later in life, which I'm going to get into later in this video. But it was my first early entrance into doing something that is tough, getting a reward for it, and having a feedback loop that was quite positive. I was training first thing in the morning, whether it's super wet, rainy in Ireland, horrific weather, also going very late at night, continuously 5 and 6 days a week. And I'd almost forgotten that this was not even normal at the time. I was playing games at the weekend, I was running track at the weekend, I devoted every single element of my life to actual sport. So much so, this became a lot of my identity. Even though I wasn't shaped as a smart kid and I didn't have that side of me, I was shaped as someone who was good at sport and could actually dedicate a lot of his time towards this. And this is what I wanted to be known for. So much so that even growing up in a very rural area, I did not have a lot of money in my family. We didn't have a lot of access to information, didn't have a lot of access to even a network. I was so remote that we didn't even have Wi-Fi. During my early years, there was no internet connection at the time, and if I did, it was some plugged-in cable that honestly was just pretty much not effective. When I got to 11 or 12, the decision came to where I was going to go to high school, and I wanted to position myself in a place that I could surround myself by sport. I went to specifically a sport and rugby school, and this was surrounded by a lot of people that were successful. A lot of families were wealthy, a lot of people had prestigious families. They were doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, business owners. They did different things. For me, I was on the outside of a lot of this. I did not have the same background as a lot of these people, but one thing we did share in common was sport in particular. So I went all in on that. And I mean all into the fact that school was just really not a focus. I had failed a lot of my exams and I scraped by the skin of my teeth through a lot of my high school exams in the early days. And so much to the point that the decision came, which was, am I going to go all in on this element of sport, or am I just going to let it fall to the side? And so I did. I had to make a decision in around 15, 16 years old. Do I go all in on athletics and try to get to the Olympics? But how many Irish guys do you see at the Olympics? Obviously 0. Or do I go down the rugby path? That's a little bit more predictable. There's a path, there's a journey there, and that's what I exactly did. So I made that decision, and shortly after I was training, and I had jumped for a ball, landed awkwardly, dislocated my kneecap, tore my ACL, ruptured my knee completely, and everything was over at that point. So everything that I had worked on at that point, the identity that I'd set for myself, the goals that I'd set for myself, and the ambition that I wanted had come to almost a crashing end at that point. And now I'm left with almost nothing. I dedicated all that time to this, and it was something that I had really struggled to come to terms with, because you think that everything is moving correctly. You think that this is the path that you're going to follow. And up until that point, I thought that was exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Doesn't matter how good I was, doesn't matter was I better than other people and so on. This is something that I'd set for myself that I had actually struggled to come to terms with. But immediately after, and how bad as the actual accident was, I knew I wanted to get back fit straight away. But the problem was, the doctors, surgeons had said that my knee was so bad that I wasn't ever going to be able to actually run at a high level again. Yet I was able to go through all the physiotherapy, all the rehab, all the stuff that I needed to do, and I was able to get back running and actually fit within 6 months. But I knew something was off. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel right in my soul, didn't feel right in my body, didn't really feel right externally, and I knew it had to come to an end. This is when I discovered the gym and really started playing much more of an infinite game. I had figured out something that had taken a lot of lessons from contact sport and from rugby, but I could really divulge all of my energy into this and just pour my heart into it. I would often go training with a massive brace down my leg, and I often looked like Forrest Gump, but I would be in the gym at 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and just was a new outlet for me to go all into. But the problem was, just training, going to the gym wasn't going to get you through school, and it also wasn't going to get you into university. So I made the decision that I'm going to go all in on education. This was not the focus for so long, but I had to figure out a way to actually get to university. So I'd put all of that same energy into seeing could we get to university. I studied all day, 12 hours a day. I'd even stop going to school sometimes just to actually put that time into actually studying. I studied in a medicine library with no windows, just so that I was all in, completely focused, literally obsessed to get there. And I got there by the skin of my teeth. I absolutely scraped by. It's almost embarrassing to see how much work I had done versus the average person and how very little I'd actually achieved during that period of time. But nonetheless, I had actually got to that period of time. At the end of my education, at the end of my high school, this is when I dipped my toe into the entrepreneurship space. So I was among many other successful families, but I was not successful. I was not surrounded by business owners. I had no one in my family, no one in my network that were entrepreneurs. I would nearly go as far to say people viewed money as like evil, or it wasn't possible, or it was for politicians or whatever, right? Insert whatever coping mechanism you want. But I had identified at that point that there was opportunity in running events. People were getting into partying. They were just 18, 19 years old. They was running different events. Music in Ireland in particular was actually really popping off at that point. It was getting more and more common. So we started running private events at that time, high school events, early college events, and they started getting actually some minor success. Now, this process wasn't something you could repeat forever, but we could run an event and we could get people to go there. People had fun and they would talk about it. And what I had realized was everything was based on content and everything was based on attention. How can we create something that people want to go to, and they want to be seen to going there? We were using Facebook at the time to actually generate interest, telling people where the party was, what the music was, who would be playing, all this kind of stuff. And this was very early on and getting a small bit of success. I remember actually having cash even in my hand and thinking for the first time that it almost felt not real. But I didn't think much of it, and I kind of went through the hum and drum of the education system, and I was quite still indoctrinated, part of the system, part of the matrix, whatever you want to call it at that time. But when I'd gone into university, everything just stepped up. We'd put everything that we'd done when we were younger and just put it on overdrive. So what I'd really focused on was, one, my fitness, my health. I went all in on bodybuilding at that time. This is when I'd spend 6-7 days of the week in the gym. I tracked everything to do with food. I tracked everything to do with training. I was becoming so obsessed with that process that it became a very good flywheel of feedback. All of these lessons became super valuable with everything that I was doing, whether it was education, running a small business, running whatever I was doing. It was the exact same principle. And I'd gone into actually competing. I'd competed in Ireland at the time. I hired a fantastic coach. I'd gone through that process, gone through that bodybuilding process in men's physique. And it was something that I was actually proud of, because at that point, up until then, I had done a few things, but nothing had really stick. This was the first time that I went all into that process. And even though it was extremely difficult, and it definitely messed with me mentally, because there's so much involved in bodybuilding and losing all that fat and gaining all that muscle and being so restrictive, that it had opened my mind into, you put everything into something, all of that focus, and you get the return that you have. Now at this point, I'm still an absolute broke student. I was going through my exams. Instead of failing my exams and scraping by them, I was now starting to get some actual success. I was getting first class honors, which is like your best grade, or second class honors, and I was actually moving the needle. But I'd realized that what I was doing was I'd overcommit and almost overcompensate to be able to get the same results as someone else, just because I didn't have that edge. I didn't have that edge that most people had, but I knew it was something that I could see myself developing. Seeing the numbers on a screen, whether you get this result, seeing the numbers in the gym where you see get your result, or if you started something and you see the revenue that you made, it was actual feedback. And we started to put the party stuff on a bigger scale. We started to run bigger events, bigger raves, and started to get bigger interest from more people. It was my first time ever that we were getting actual success. And this is how we were able to kind of replicate that process. And we only did it a few times, but I knew that I was like, this is something that is interesting. And I knew I was getting much more of a fulfilling element from. If you compare that to working a job, which I had done at that point, there was no real fulfillment. And during that period of time to actually generate money, I'd actually worked in a pizza shop, would you believe? And I was making pizzas on the side. I initially started taking the phone calls for the pizza shop, but they didn't actually want me talking to customers, so they put me in the back making the pizza. And at one point, I was the only person making the pizza and pouring tomato sauce on pizzas and throwing them through the oven. That was obviously the worst things that I could possibly be doing, but it gave me a lot of interest. It made me show me what I didn't want to do. It may show me the value of actually working hard, because those jobs are hard to work on. If you're working those hard jobs in those companies, it's super, super difficult. So I actually commend people that do this, and I think it's super important. I'd also worked in like a shoe shop. I'd basically done every side of everything possible to make a small bit of money. That's basically it. I had no ego, probably had a big ego to be honest, but I had no ego to do with actually making money. And that's why I was happy to work in a pizza shop a couple of days a week, make a couple of pizzas, get a bit of money. And we also had free food. So it was good for the boys, and you could bring back a box of food at that time. My first actual job from here though was an internship in London. And this is when I had really opened my eyes into the entrepreneurship space. So I'd moved from Ireland at that time to London. And for most people, that's like a big move. It was just a stepping stone for me. But I moved over to London, and I was working at an investment bank in like an operations role, like a typical finance role as an intern. I was basically doing nothing, but it was my first thing that I realized that this world is, one, not that I want, the 9-to-5 world, and two, the contrast is what I could build. I remember working in Canary Wharf in an area in London that's flashy, status driven. It's all about how you look. It's all about who you talk to. It's all about how you interact with other people, all this kind of stuff. And on the first day, I walk through this office and it's super dark, dreary, and I just see everyone fat, bald, miserable, with their head down, eating food at their desk. I'm 21 years old. I'm just getting into my working world, and everyone there is in their late 30s, very miserable, very down, not happy, not interested. And in contrast, you have me coming in who's generally pretty upbeat. I was coming from the gym every single morning into my job, and I would have two bags. I'd have one bag with my laptop and a second bag with all of my food. It would just be chicken, rice, broccoli, the standard, typical bodybuilding diet. And I remember placing all of the lunchboxes in the fridge, and people would come in and say, this is just a phase. You're going to run out of this when you're in your late 20s. It's not going to stick around. Everyone starts this stuff when they're young, and it's all to do about how you look. But for me, it was not to do with how you look. That's how you get into the gym. That's how you get into fitness, how you get into personal development. And it's all about how you feel afterwards and the impact it has afterwards. So they had seen a lot of the surfaces, whereas I was seeing much more of the broader picture of, I want to be healthy, I want to be wealthy, and I want to have strong relationships. Most of these people would stay in the office to hide from their family. I was the opposite. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to go out and do fun things with cool people and do pretty interesting stuff. And I remember at the very beginning, my manager at the time had told me that they do Thirsty Thursdays every single Thursday, which was we go down after work, we'd spend all day working together, and now we're going to go out and get pissed together. And this was something that was very weird to me, because I just thought to myself, well, I couldn't go to Thirsty Thursdays because one, we're working tomorrow, and two, I want to be in the gym in the morning. And I had said this, and I was instantly kind of ostracized. I was pushed to the side. It was like, okay, this guy thinks he's better than everyone. I didn't think I was better than everyone, but maybe that was interpreted like that. It is what it is. But this was something that I'd really seen a lot of friction from. So this job, that it was status driven, that people said it was desirable, I instantly didn't want. And this is when I'd become very down on myself. I'd started partying a lot more. I'd already partied quite a lot at that point, but I'd been going to a lot of clubs. I'd be out till 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd be up for 2 days straight, 3 days straight. I was constantly just out, leaning into Tinder, dates, all that stuff. I'd lean into all of the vices. I never speak about any of that stuff. I'm looking down on it because I had done all of it, especially in my early 20s. But I was so disgruntled that even though I was kind of doing degenerate stuff, I still had ambition, right? I still wasn't just sitting there just doing nothing. And at that point, that's when I had kind of dipped my toe into the e-commerce world. So I'd observed that from going to a lot of raves, that rave clothes, specifically 90s clothes, Adidas, Nike, Stone Island, all that stuff was super trendy and people really wanted it. So instead of going to the raves, I wanted to sell rave clothes to rave kids. And I had started an e-commerce store, getting a lot of vintage clothing from the south of Italy. I remember stacking up my entire tiny apartment in boxes. And at that point, I didn't even know what boxes were arriving. It would just be a random collection of clothes that I would try to resell. And at the point, I actually started to resell them. People would start buying things on Shopify. It was your typical story of seeing your notifications pop up when you're waking up in the morning, and I would see an order for $70, $90, $100, and I was getting super excited. So I'm only making $150 a day max at my prestigious job, but I was making that money throughout the course of the day or over a couple of days with e-commerce. But like every good story, it comes into the next challenge that I had. And the second I started buying more products and trying to advertise the products, people weren't buying them at the price that I needed at, which meant my cash flow got super sucked up. And at that point, I had completely run out of cash. So the business had generated revenue, but we spent most of that revenue on acquiring customers. And then we ended up going completely bust. I remember sitting on a bunch of stock, not being able to sell it, thinking, what on earth am I going to do? I had to send a lot of it back to Ireland at the time. And I was pretty much in a pretty embarrassing moment because I'd realized that this was something that I'd built myself and it wasn't working. I had really done everything though. And this are building the skills. I'd built a website on Shopify. I'd done the design. I'd taken the photos. I'd modeled all the photos myself for all the clothing. I'd modeled absolutely everything. I'd sold everything. I would go to the post box and put it into the envelope and try to sell it and pretend that it wasn't a big package, even though it was a big package, to pay the extra fee. All that stuff. I'd done all that stuff. And then it came to a crashing halt. But I'd learned so much skills at that point, but I'd started to detangle from the system. I started to figure out that this job that wants me to go drinking and go partying, in contrast to me doing something that's much more fulfilling, what's going on here? It started to send signals. And at this point, I'd started to travel a lot more. I'd spent a lot of time across Europe. I'd spent a lot of time meeting other people. A lot of my actual friends I'd end up traveling with anyway. I spent a lot of time in Asia. It was my first time stepping into Asia at the time. And I remember going to Bangkok and arriving in the airport and going out and smelling all the smog and the sound and the air and eating my first Thai food in Asia specifically and falling in love with that process. So my mind had started to mold. It started to become a bit more malleable. It started to become a bit more open to different possibilities than go to this job and hate your life and so on. Regardless, I went back to Ireland at that time. And I went back and I'd finished university and I was working at a small startup at the time, and I was seeing again how things can connect and the benefit and beauty of building versus just sitting in an office and doing a job. And I think the idea of sitting in an office and doing a job is just so not aligned to who we are as like people. I think everybody is a builder, whether you want to call yourself an entrepreneur or not. You are a builder. You build products, families, your body, your brain. You're a builder. And when I'd finished university at that time, I reluctantly, embarrassingly, took a job at a big company in Ireland. And it was probably my biggest regret. It had given me a lot of insight, for sure, into what I don't want. But I was now working at this large company, and it was at complete odds to the opportunities that I'd built, the small business that I built, the e-commerce that I was running. This was at odds to it, and I was taking the advice of people with the results of stuff that I didn't really even want. I was taking advice from people that I didn't even want their life. And now I'd done stuff that was completely misaligned. And I remember being in Dublin, going into the office at the time, and again, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, getting the tram at the time, bunch of homeless people, super dangerous on the tram, getting off 6 o'clock in the morning, the wind, hail, absolute like sheer winter weather in Ireland. It's just awful weather, ripping me sideways, going into the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning and heading into the office at around 8 a.m. And I remember distinctly the doors being locked at 8 o'clock in the morning and I couldn't get in there. And outside was just a bunch of tents and homeless people sitting in front of this office. And I couldn't get into the building to go into work. And eventually the security guard showed up and he cleared up the space. And I said, like, you know, what the hell's going on? I want to go in and like work effectively. And he's like, oh, no. We don't start till like 9. We don't start till 9, come back later. And it was lashing around at that point. And I thought this was completely at odds to what I want. I want to build. I want to do cool things. I want to be surrounded by people who want to do cool things. And that's when I went into a real like valley of despair. I didn't know what I was doing. I was working on this dumb project with this company that I had no interest in. I hated what I was doing, and I was doing this for no particular reason, and I was flat broke. This is when we started to rack up a ton of debt. I had leverage on my car from university. I had student loan debt. I had a bunch of other debts from living in the UK, and I got up to that minus 10k mark, which again, that was normal. It's normal in university to come out with that debt, but I wasn't making the money back. And this is what was super interesting. So at that point, we're pretty down at that point now. And now again, I'm almost back to nothing. I put everything into university and we got this job, prestigious, and I ended up in nothing. So at that point, I'm thinking, well, how the hell did I get out of here? If we go back a couple of years, I spent a lot of time traveling all across Asia, all across Europe. And I remember thinking like, what in that space could I solve? What problem could I solve specifically? And I remember when I was partying and up all night, I'd always like nearly lose my passport. I'd be in these hostels partying with a bunch of people and probably up to no good. And I'd almost lose my passport every single time. I thought, well, maybe I could create a digital passport. And everyone was like, no, that's stupid. That's a bad idea. No one's going to do that. No one's going to want it. And I said, fuck it, let's see. So I had gone all the way to Dublin Airport. I sat outside the departure lounge. I looked like a very dodgy character. And I started asking people, would they use it? What problems did they have with their passport? Would they use a passport? Would they use an app? Would they feel secure with it? Is there enough security with it? What would they need to do this? And overwhelmingly, everyone said they'd use it. So I go back to my apartment. I stay up all night for 3 days straight at the weekend. My roommates are not there at the time, and I'm staying up all night and I'm building these prototypes. Monday comes, I ring a bunch of people that I knew when I lived in London, and I look for insights into getting capital, raising money from venture capitalists, from angel investors as well. And I have a bunch of these meetings, and I remember going in, cocky, arrogant kid who's like, I don't know what age I was even was at that time, 23, maybe 24, and everyone just looking down on me. Instantly no, terrible idea, not going to work. And if I was to look at the underlying element there, the main idea was I lacked influence and authority. So we go back to the earlier businesses. When I was running ecom, I had no influence and authority, so I had to run ads and I ended up with no money. No one followed the brand. When I ran the earlier events, I actually had a bit of a click with it. People knew of me. I wasn't famous, but they just knew of me locally. So at that point, they were able to have a bit of influence and authority. And specifically when it came to trying to build a startup, which is arguably the hardest business of all time to build. You raise a ton of money, you eat ramen for like 4 years, and then it's a horrific life. I couldn't do it because no one knew who I was, no one would look at me, and everyone just thought this was just a random kid. Even if the idea was the best idea in the world, and to this day, I still think it was a pretty good idea. This is also pre-pandemic, would you believe? So we're back in square one right now, and this is 24 years old at this point. And I remember thinking to myself, I was good at action and taking a ton of action, but I was terrible at implementation. So it was time to stop trying to build stuff, and it was time to listen and learn. I was deep down the podcast space at that point. I was listening to people like Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan, and I'd come across Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. This was the first book that had made me realize that it wasn't about the destination. It was about, one, the pursuit, and two, the struggle in the pursuit. In all aspects of man's journeys, there's always going to be a massive challenge. And that challenge is the obstacle. And that obstacle is basically the whole purpose behind what you do in your life. And at that point, then I was really deep down the aspects thinking, well, it's okay to not have it all figured out. It's okay to just be trying to piece things together. And what can I do at that point? So the idea of listening and learning was me starting a podcast. So even though I had very little money, this is when I had bought my first microphone on Amazon. I even had a money back guarantee just in case things wouldn't work out and just in case I wanted to actually return it. I was using my laptop camera, which was the worst laptop you could even imagine at the time, that was sticking up in front of me, and I was recording on Zoom, and it was the most imperfect thing you could ever imagine. And I remember recording 3 episodes in the beginning, and my guests were great, but I was terrible. And at that point, I had to make a decision. Do I release this or do I return it and go backwards? I was hovering over my phone, getting ready to press publish beforehand. I remember I'd never felt so much anxiety in my entire life because at that point, nothing that I was doing was public. All the businesses were private. Everything was private. I didn't have to tell anyone. If it failed, no one even knew. And even to this day, a lot of people don't even know about those failures. And this was the first thing that was public. I pressed publish, and that's when I started getting the first bit of feedback. Even though it looked terrible, many people who I'm still speaking with and friends with to this day have said, this is how I feel as well. I feel very similar to you in this scenario. You're just getting started. I know exactly like the pain, the struggle of it. They had faced similar issues, and we had a very strong bond being built. This is 4 years ago now. This was the very early instance of this. And the biggest thing for me was that I felt so annoyed with myself because I like to talk, as you can probably tell from this video so far, but I was so bad at communicating that there was a gap. And it was a gap between where I was and where I wanted to be was this podcast. And this was a way for me to learn and develop and learn all the different things of myself, as well as learn all the insights from the guests. The podcast had nothing to do with the online business space. Online business space was not even invented back then. It was still just regular businesses. And I was interviewing startup founders, all this kind of stuff. And I was realizing that, damn, this is a huge gap between where I am and where I want to be. But these people are not too far from me. They don't have a third eye. They don't have a third arm. They don't have 27 hours in a day. They're just the exact same as me, just after doing something different. And I really fell in love with that process. I was making no money from there. I was still working in tech jobs at the time. And I was just figuring out all of this process as we go. But I'd become really obsessed with even the setup of everything. How the cameras looked, how the audio looked. What could I do with $50? What could I do with $100? Maybe I could use my iPhone and stick it to the wall. What were these different things that I could replicate and really do? Also on the content side specifically, what was the areas in the strategy that even before I even knew about strategy at the time, how could I improve that episode flow? So I realized that most people, this was a trend, and we were one of the first podcasts to really double down on YouTube. And I was vocal about that point as well, that I was saying that this was the future. Video podcasts were specifically the future in 2020. And most people at that point would actually send me so much hate online. These audio nerds would say that this was never going to be a thing. Podcasts are for audio. It's all going to fade out. But I had realized that this was about to pop off exactly when COVID hit. And when the pandemic hit, it all imploded. It all went down. And that's when I went all in on a podcast. I was at home at the time. I was working a tech job. I'd spend 4 hours working on my tech job, and I would just spend all day on this every single day. So the hours from 5 to 9 and all the evening would all be spent on figuring out this process. So much so that at the point, people would ask me at the time about how to podcast. So again, I had no influence and authority in the world, but I was playing much more of an infinite game, and I was much more going just down this pursuit of something that, even though I didn't have a background in videography, cinematics and videos and production, editing, design, people were asking me how I would do it. And this was like, this is interesting. And I would just offer some free help as always, like, hey, like this is what I would do. This is my experience. I could just speak from experiences, not from advice, just speak from experiences. And those experiences led into consulting other podcasts. And my first 3 clients paid me a grand total of $0. And I was so proud to this day that they paid me no money, because I was learning the lessons. I was acquiring knowledge and acquiring skills, interacting with people, and they were getting insane value as a result. But again, I didn't realize the signals. I was still working a job, and I had moved to Singapore at the time, and I was ramping things up at this point, and I'd fallen deeper down the rabbit hole of podcasting. When I was in Singapore, I really wanted to ramp up all aspects of our production. Even though I was making no dollars at the time, I knew we were on to something small. Shortly after that, a couple of months later, I had my first paying client to do podcasting. And the problem that I recognized was that if I tell someone what to do, I wasn't able to help them actually implement it. It was an issue with me. I didn't have much consulting, coaching, mentoring, advice, whatever you want to describe it as. So instead, I had my own team do the work for other people. And this is when we started an agency. It was initially called KS Media, Kickoff Sessions, KS. I thought it was quite interesting at the time. And the first podcast that we had paid us $600 a month and paid us for 3 months and even paid upfront, which is so wild to think of right now. And we would take their episodes, produce them, edit them, write the copy, release them, all the stuff that we're doing right now to this day on a bigger scale. But I just didn't even listen to the feedback. I just thought it was a nice side hustle thing. I didn't even go all in on it. I just completely resented that process. I was like, it is what it is. I was still doing all my dumb stuff up until I'd moved to Singapore. And when I'd moved to Singapore, this is when everything started to change for me. The second I got there, I realized a couple of things. The people that I interviewed were steps ahead of me, not because they were hugely smarter than me, but because they had taken more action. And the biggest thing for me that I had to let go was partying. I gave up alcohol, I gave up drinking, I gave up all of those degenerate things that were holding me back so I could go all in specifically on my show. And I went all in on that process. I still wasn't thinking about it from a business. I wanted to improve the actual episodes. And I wanted to create a new standard at the time. We were doing in-person production in Singapore. We felt really deep down that rabbit hole. We were getting some insane cuts being created. And we were really creating a new standard for how podcasts can be done. We were on the road. We were traveling, meeting cool people, growing more, getting referrals all the time, people started to realize that this kid is not going away. And in a world of mediocrity, people love someone who's obsessed. Even if they don't even believe that much in the process, they will stick with you through the hard times if you're truly about what you do. And that's exactly what we were. We were just all in 24/7 on the podcast and getting more interest at that time. But in my personal life, things were taking a bit of a turn because the job that I had worked at the time, which again was meant to be a prestigious tech job, started to turn for the worst. It was a very bad culture. I started to work very late hours. I was up until like 2 o'clock in the morning every single night working on it. And it was something that I could not see myself doing. I was looking at my manager and my manager's manager and thought to myself, do I really want that life? Definitely not. This is not a life that I want. And this is also not even that profitable. We weren't even making that much money. For full transparency, I was making probably $100K a year. And I was 25, 26 years old at that point. And for me, I wanted to be making much more than that. I'd set aspirations to be making over $1 million a year by the time I was 30. And that was when I was super young. And I'd forgotten about all of these things, but I knew that something could have happened. Maybe it was a podcast thing that could make things change. And my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, had even given that idea. She was like, hey, you were getting lots of interest from people. Why don't you just speak to more people? I thought, that's interesting. So the idea was, let's start putting a pot together to get out. I followed Justin Welch's approach, which is to get to 60% of your salary and then be able to jump ship from that point. I remember distinctly going back to Ireland on Christmas Eve and sitting inside Starbucks all day, 12 hours on Christmas Eve, creating a rebrand from KS Media into what has now become Voix. And we were slowly getting that feedback. And the second I did the rebrand, people started thinking of it as a business. People started seeing me as an entrepreneur. I wasn't just this creator with a side hustle on the side. People started seeing me as the entrepreneur as a result. And we had signed our first proper client, I think honestly, within 20 days. We got someone for like $1,500 a month, started to get a refined process, and it was an absolute mess, right? There was no operations, no background. But we started to work through a operational process that I call our growth flywheel method right now, which is the strategy, growth, and monetization of brands. But we didn't even have that in the beginning. We just had something very, very basic. One client turned into 2 clients, and after 2 or 3 months, we were up to in around $6,000 or $7,000 a month. We'd even got to $10,000 a month very, very quickly. And it was just a simple process of producing podcasts, giving them a systematic approach, and taking care of everything and giving them back all their time, because the people that we were working with were entrepreneurs. They're busy. They don't have time to produce their episodes. They just want to record, and that's the end of it. And that's exactly what we did. I had put together a small plan. I had used me as the ultimate case study. And for yourself, you are the best case study if you can do what you say you're going to do. No matter what I'd done in the past, no one had asked for a CV, no one had asked for a degree, no one had asked for even case studies. I just showed them me and I said, this is how we'd write the thumbnails, this is how we'd make the copy, this is how we'd edit the podcast. And people were like, okay, like just do that for me. And then we started to get our case studies. So you didn't need any of the bells and whistles. It was just a systematic process that we were able to replicate. And at that point, I knew it was time to jump. I'd put together a plan, I'd put together a strategy, and I had slowly started to meet people and start getting a bit of success. I did our first tour in Dubai, and this was the first podcast tour that started to set the space for going places and doing cool stuff. We'd interview people like Justin Water, Sadia Khan. We'd really put our foot in the actual place that, hey, we're not joking here. And it started to be well received. People wanted the same process replicated, but as a very, very small agency at the time, we weren't able to really replicate it for everyone. We couldn't service everyone for $100 a month. It had to be higher ticket. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of getting involved in high ticket in the beginning. We had a very strategic pattern in place though, and I had made the jump with $8,000 in my bank account. No education to do with online courses, all that kind of stuff. Just 8K. I moved out of Singapore. I moved back to Bali, which I'd spent a bit of time in when I was younger. And I knew I wanted to get set up there and just go all in 24/7. Because it was the same thing. Just if I was doing a bit of outreach, I could do more outreach. If I was doing a bit of marketing, I could do more marketing. I could do the same thing just on steroids effectively. And that's when we started to hire, started to bring in some really good people, good designers who'd stay with us for many years, good editors. I had managed to hire our first operations manager, who has now become our COO of our company. We started to piece everything together and put things on steroids. This is when the agency started to grow more. We became much more of a media company. It wasn't an agency, it was a media company. We were teaching people, our current clients, exactly how to grow their podcast, monetize their show, fix the strategy, and turn it into the business. And the way I situate this is a 6-figure business is running a podcast. A 7-figure business is growing a podcast, and an 8-figure business is monetizing a podcast. So we were able to get all of these key components in place and just replicate success. Get more clients across the US, more clients across Europe, more clients across Australia, and just keep building this out more and more and more. And the insight came from all the episodes that I had done, the experience that I had, the influence that I had acquired, even though it was small, in our small space, is that was the unique mechanism. That was a unique thing that made me different, made the approach different, made everything that we were doing just unique. The media company at this point had become larger than I thought. We ran into different products. We started sponsoring shows. We started working with some of the biggest sponsors in the entire world. We'd built a network of different podcasts to be able to sponsor. We started running paid promotions for a lot of these brands too. And we started to even build our offers in the back end because I was so confident of what I was doing for myself that we could start building this exact model for other people. It gets us back to the growth flywheel model. We were getting the strategy done, we were getting the growth done, and then we were getting the monetization done. So now we have a list of podcasts that are in our portfolio. We have a list of businesses that sit under there, and we just keep pushing on at that point. Bringing it up to our first US tour, which is going to New York and interviewing some amazing guests, people like Justin Welsh. I'd learned from for many years, and now at this point, we had built a business beyond what he was even teaching at that point. It was a much bigger machine, and it allowed me to travel around the world and meet the most amazing people. So all the guests that you see, and you see on kickoff sessions every single week, I just built relationships with them. And I'd realized that all of this game was not to do with the quick fixes, not to do with the hacks. It wasn't about how many views you get on TikTok. It wasn't about controversy. It wasn't about creating drama. It was about relationships. It was a relationship that I built with my audience. It was a relationship that I built with the podcast, the relationship that I built with our clients. Some of these clients have still stayed with us so many years later, which is actually kind of wild to even think about. And even the relationships we'd built across the world. And it allowed me to show up in any particular city in the world, put up on an Instagram story, any cool people to interview, meet cool people, and just broaden my horizons. So people always talk about like the lonely path of an entrepreneur. I never had that. I never ever had that because I've been forced to sit down and record these amazing podcasts with people every single week. And I've also allowed me to learn from these people. Every single thing you see today is lessons that I've learned from the 250 episodes. It's all of the insights that I've learned from other people is what I've been able to use. Yes, I went on to invest in myself. I bought into huge programs. I paid $8K, $10K, $12K to learn the in and outs of sales, marketing, operations, all of that stuff. All of that stuff just comes. But it all starts with the vessel and the vehicle that you have. I just picked podcasting. It just worked very well for me, probably because back then teachers were telling me that I was too dyslexic to read and write, remember? So for you, it could be reading, it could be writing, it could be whatever. It could just be something that puts you in your zone of genius. When we got back from the US at that point, it was more of a time to scale the media company. I didn't want to be just be known as just an agency that just does stuff. I wanted to be broader at that point. And if you think about where the success was, it was often educating people. It was often consulting, offering insight, offering advice that most people and most companies would not offer. They wouldn't sit on calls with clients. They wouldn't do workshops with clients. So I thought, how can we replicate that and build out our incubator? And our incubator has allowed us to help many other people solve the same problem, which is growing a podcast with ease, making it as easy as possible to grow. And this incubator program became this amazing mentorship that was able to bring people into our ecosystem and teach them everything, all the growth, the strategy, the monetization, to do this for themselves. And many of these people have ended up wanting to work with us anyway. So it became a way to have an agency component, have a coaching component, and have both working side by side. You have self-paced content, you have ongoing weekly calls, you have strategy stuff, you have one-to-ones, and then you have a done-for-you component. So that's the entire suite of offers that you can basically offer someone. And it's just been in a very, very narrow vertical, which has allowed me to express myself the best allowed me to explore different ideas and try new things. So if you think about that small business in the beginning, it was just helping a few people for free, which I always recommend, to getting up into your first couple of clients. We had hit that glorious 10K a month barrier. We'd got to 30K a month. We'd got to 50K a month. We'd got to 80K a month. We'd got to 90K a month. And it was all became this natural progression. The time period from there was all the way back 3, 4, 5 years ago when it was minus 10, 20K in debt. But being able to build that up, the actual building process has only been 18 to 20 months, if you think about it. The podcast build has been much longer because that's me cutting my teeth in something, developing those real skills to be able to monetize them later. And that's why the more that you build, the more that you learn about the different components of your art increases the value and increases asymmetrical returns as much further on in the path. So now that we're at this glorious million a year point, it's a good stepping stone to show exactly what's happened in retrospect, but it's not a stopping point. This is not where you get complacent, where you slow down, go backwards. It's actually the opposite. This is actually where we speed up and we increase our surface area of luck by having more opportunity, more offers for people, more ways for people to get involved in kickoff sessions, in VOICs, and the ecosystem that we've built. The ecosystem is the most important, valuable part of what I want to build, is because instead of having a simple, small business, we are having a bigger impact on people. You have the most amount of free content you could possibly find on the internet through kickoff sessions. You can build your business. You can do whatever you want from that content. And maybe there's an opportunity for you to go build a podcast too one day. And at every stage, I've often had different mentors and coaches that have come to me at the right point in time. When I was just starting out the podcast, it could have been Man's Search for Meaning and just a book. When I had grown up, I become a mentor called Ned Phillips, who was the first person to believe in me. When we were sitting in a coffee shop in Singapore, and he was the first person who said that I could actually build a business on my own. Whether it was my first client or the first big client that we got, Rob Lipset, that most people might know, he was the first person to put confidence in myself. He literally said, okay, dude, go do it. Like, you know what you're doing, just go run it. It's all about having that small stepping stones, which just come as part of the journey. So the entire kind of journey through the entire Infinite game has been a series of just playing a game that I want to play. It's not chasing the hacks, it's not chasing the tricks. It's not even just trying to get a quick win. And I've noticed that all of the success have come from the moments in time where I'm not trying to make money online and trying to flash something. It's just been a consistent, ongoing period of time. And then the asymmetrical returns come in. It's like you have no leads and then you have loads of leads. There's a barrier and there is a delay between the work that you do and the actual result that you get. And that time delay is where all the success comes in. Most people don't see is like the hard work, all the grind phase, whatever you want to call it. And that's been the actual gap between the two. So that's been the entire journey so far, and there's been a lot more going on. And during this process, this is when we've refined the podcast growth flywheel. This is when we've got tighter and tighter and tighter during that process. And I've actually also given you the entire framework for the growth flywheel. You can find that down below in the comments. It's just a simple video that goes into more details on exactly that framework that you can use yourself. It's completely free. There's nothing involved. It's completely free. So go check that out if you actually want to. But the main thesis here, the main takeaway play that I want you to understand is that if you're playing much more of an infinite game, you're going to get the results you want over a longer period of time. It's going to be much more of an elegant business, a calmer business, something that you can go and replicate and so on and so forth. All of those skills that I've learned has been represented in the podcast. All of the inputs have been represented in the podcast, and the outcome that we want has come from the podcast. It has been my vessel to create the brand that I want, create the life that I want, be in somewhere like I am now today in Miami, travel around the US, interviewing amazing guests, learn, meet cool people, and just basically have an enjoyable life that I want to live. If you compare that to trying to go into my 9 to 5 in Dublin in the lashing rain and not even be able to get into the office to work, it's been a long journey. And I think for the next couple of years, it's going to be a continuation of this. So I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, just let me know down below in the comments, and I'll see you in the next episode of Kickoff Sessions, which will be released shortly.